As a child, I guess I was really quiet and introspective and introverted. So I had friends but I still think I'm very happy being by myself. And as a kid, I used to run around, collect insects, and always loved insects. And I think I had a brother who kind of inspired me to be interested in science and asking questions because he would ask me things and to teach me stuff. And I used to then just start asking myself all the time, why does it work like this? How does that work? I love to take things apart. My father would say, "What the heck are you doing? Why?" Because I'd break stuff. But I wanted to see how things worked, and I still like that. So I really love still the interrelatedness of things. And I think as you go through life and you get older, and which I've seemed to have done quite a bit, I'm always taken by the interrelatedness of everything. And I think at work, working with patients, working with scientists, working with policy, everything is so interrelated. The way that traffic on the street works is so interrelated to everything else that's going on, and people making turns and changing lanes. And because I just keep wondering, why are things the way they are? And so you start to observe things. I guess I've always been very observant, always gravitated towards science. Started out studying botany and horticulture, and then I had to take entomology as part of that. And I was so taken with entomology because I always thought insects seemed like they're from another planet. They're just so different. I wasn't a great student, I have to admit, going through school. And suddenly when I got to high school, for some reason, something clicked and I started to really enjoy it. And went from being a C student to an A student. I don't know actually why. I think it was just that I was interested, and things suddenly were more, it wasn't rote learning. It was understanding things like the chemistry classes and biology classes that we took. I thought were great, and I loved all that stuff. We took geology, and those were always like great classes. It was always the mathematics that was dragging me down. So, but then you're going to go to college and everybody's asking you, so what are you going to do? And you're kind of stuck with trying to think of something. So I thought, I've always liked plants too. Went into botany and horticulture, and it was okay. I really enjoyed it until I took the entomology class. And then I just thought, this is great. I just loved the entomology class. So I shifted my majored in entomology, went from school to, there's a place in South Carolina called the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory. And it's at the Savannah River plant, which is where the US used to make their nuclear materials. And so there were a group of people who worked at this lab, and we would look at things like transuranic, how elements travel through the environment. And because there had been reactors that were live, reactors that were decommissioned, and places on this 310 square mile reserve where there had never been reactors, we had all kinds of environments where we could do comparisons. And so that was really great. So I was working on species diversity studies to see what happens with hot effluents running through these streams to cooling ponds. And I really enjoyed working there, but I didn't like working around the nuclear materials. I had forgotten that I had put in an application with the federal government. This is my mother's suggestion. Well, you never know, you should put in an application. So I had filed an application, and lo and behold, I get this phone call from FDA saying, well, we need an entomologist. So I got out all my notebooks and I looked up all these, I thought they were going to test me on taxonomy. And so it was kind of interesting. They interviewed me and I got hired as an entomologist, went to Brooklyn, New York, which was great. And I was there for 14 years. And you look at, we would look at samples of food primarily, but samples of everything, that might be contaminated with insect fragments usually. And you would determine whether or not these insects were storage pests or were they field insects, because there has to be some allowance for a level of insect material in foods. Otherwise, they'd be extremely expensive.
That is the scariest thing I ever heard anybody say.
I always thought it's better than having pesticides. And the laboratory next door did pesticide analysis, and they would, look at foods and they would extract the fats and then analyze for pesticides to make sure that they were not unapproved pesticides at unapproved levels. And I always felt like the insect lab was the better lab. And so I worked there for a long time. And, and then at FDA, there was a question about 2 animal drugs that were being used in animal feed. And the question was whether or not the residue from those animal drugs that were fed to the animals, were there carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic residues in the carcasses and the meat. So they needed somebody to come down who was analytical and didn't know anything about animal drugs. So somebody called me up and said, hey, would you like to come down and work on this? And I said, well, if you give me some background, because how could I do this without knowing anything? And they said, well, that's the whole idea. We want somebody who has no idea so that you're objective, come in, look at the evidence, judge the evidence, and then come to conclusions. So this had been, the agency took an action against the 2 drugs. It was appealed by the companies who made the drugs. Then the appeal was settled in favor of the agency. They appealed it again, and then it goes for a commissioner decision. But the commissioner had other things to do. So they looked for somebody to work on this, look at the evidence, build up a case. I presented it to the commissioner. He gave it the old check, and it was successful. So those 2 drugs are no longer used in swine and fowl. But that's how I ended up getting down to Rockville, which is where FDA was headquartered. And I couldn't work in the Center for Vet Medicine, which is where those drugs are regulated. So I had to work in the Office of the Commissioner. So I sat in the Office of Health Affairs, and that office oversaw IRBs. So it ended up being a very long project. It was about 1.5 years in doing this project on these drugs, where I learned an awful lot about animal studies and about clinical trials and just a whole host of things. But in the office was the IRB activities. And when I had gotten to the office, I didn't know what an IRB was. So somebody threw the IRB information sheets at me, said, read this. And after 1.5 years of being in that office, I started to get a sense of it. So the director of the office, when I finished the project, said, hey, how'd you like to stay in the office? Which I thought was a great offer. So I moved all my stuff down from New York and moved to Rockville and started working there. And I thought the IRB area was just the most amazing place. The Common Rule was formulating at that time. So I got involved in the Common Rule writing group, which was the first time I'd ever gotten involved in regulation. And it's another really interesting area, because you think, oh, how difficult could that be? But when you get a whole panoply of people together and everybody's got different perspectives to take care of, you start to realize how flexible regulations really need to be. And you think, well, they're all written in this legalese kind of language, and who can understand them? But I think they're written in a very elegant way to allow flexibility, to allow things that nobody is foreseeing. Because I think, things pop up that nobody ever expected, and you want the regulation to be able to be flexible enough to be stretched around that situation. So people really think an awful lot about that. At the time, the Office for Protection from Research Risks, OPRR, which is now OHRP, they reopened Subpart B of the HHS regulations. And it was the same kind of experience with, we'd go down there every 2 weeks and have this big meeting, and things that you would never think of came to bear with, like, how do you define these terms? each of the institutes at NIH was throwing in things that I'd never thought of. And I thought, wow, what a terrific process this really is. And I thought, again, there's this interrelatedness question of you really need to see how all of it fits together and what everybody's perspective is, because you need to ultimately account for those people's perspectives and problems before they happen, or as, in a way that they can be accommodated. And I was really taken by the ethics of it and how ethics there's nothing about ethics that's solid, really, in my mind. It's so flexible and movable. And I think back to things like, people now say, well, how could Tuskegee possibly have happened? And lots of things that have happened. And I think you can't look at it from 2014 and say, how could that have happened? You have to look at it from the time that it was happening forward and see how everything changes and how people's perceptions of things really, really change over time. And as those perceptions change, so do the ethics, because people have different interpretations now than they did before. And I think when I was growing up, the jokes that people made, totally unacceptable now, and yet they were so common in those times. And now I think people would say, oh, those kind of comments would be unethical. But at the time, they certainly weren't, And so I was always really intrigued by the fact that people look for ethical answers, and it's like a water balloon that no matter where you push it, it's popping out somewhere else. And it's just such a moving quicksand kind of terrain for the most part. And the way it happens is somebody has an opinion, they write it, and then people start to accept it, and then the thinking changes. But it's not really like a science that's based in, empirical data where you look at this as a solid and it's always going, the chemical reaction will always be the same because you're using these chemicals. This is what happens with the bonds. And I think it's all the bonds inside people's heads. And over time, there's a lot of give and take. And I think that's kind of one of the great things about ethics. The first time I came to Primer, I was talking about the common rule. So what was that, 93 or something? And somebody in the office had said to me, well, as you're going as a federal official, you might as well just put a target on your chest because you're going to be attacked. And I thought, oh, I can hardly wait to go to Primer. So I was really nervous about coming, and I thought, this is going to be a very bad experience. And I got there, and I thought, what a terrific place. And people just had really wonderful topics that everyone was talking about, and things that I had never thought about. And people struggling so hard to figure out, how do you get people to understand an informed consent? How do you make it short enough that it's readable? How do you make it understandable? How do you get all the information in? And over the years, working with different communities, I talked to a lot of people, a lot of patients who have problems with their research participation. And I always go, do you still have your informed consent? Let's go through it. And I'm amazed at how little, not how little, there are so many things that people see what they want or remember it the way they want. I remember one situation where somebody insisted that something was due to them, and I said, well, let's look at the informed consent. And they had heard it wrong because it was clearly spelled out in the informed consent. And the person said, well, that's not what they said to me. I'm thinking, well, it probably was. But the fact was that they had signed the informed consent and that was their agreement. And, but, coming to Primer, people struggle with this all the time. And people are really thinking, and I think the people here, they're so thoughtful. They're so very smart. Things that you gain experience and you gain wisdom, I think. And the wisdom is the knowledge plus the judgment. And I think getting people together to talk about this stuff, everybody's judgment improves because then you start to see all the different facets that really have to come into play. And there's the interrelatedness again. There's just so many facets. And I think they play off each other and everybody comes out with so much more than they went in with. And then I think the decisions are better. And the real problem with that is then you get a phone call from a patient, and I feel like they don't understand any of that at all. And you can spend a half an hour or even an hour on the phone and explain it. And a lot of times people go, I didn't understand it before. And other times people dig their heels in and they say, well, they owe me this and I should be entitled to that, or I was mistreated. But I think for the most part, it's a process that I don't think anybody's trying to pull one over on subjects. I think everybody's trying to do the best they can. And there's just a lot to do. And it becomes overwhelming for the person who has to read it. Well, after I had been working with the IRBs for about 4 or 5 years, the AIDS epidemic was kind of swelling up. I had known lots of people in New York who had died from AIDS. It was in New York, it was very omnipresent. It was everywhere. And I thought, I used to read things like the New York Native, and FDA was always very roundly criticized. Everybody thought FDA was holding up or not developing drugs or holding up access to drugs, when in fact FDA doesn't do drug development. Basically, people at FDA were working toward getting drugs on the market, but there was no basic science at that point, and there really wasn't a target, and things weren't very focused. So I had suggested to somebody at FDA that we needed to have somebody who would explain what FDA really does, rather than just sitting there and taking the arrows. And at one point, actually after the 1988 AIDS activist demonstration had closed the agency down for a day, there was an Office of AIDS Coordination, an AIDS coordination staff that developed to just sort of coordinate things between different parts of the agency on HIV-related activities, AIDS-related activities at that time. And then in 1994, it expanded to an office. And I applied for the job to working with the HIV community because I felt like I was already part of that community in a way. And I didn't know what I was getting in for either. So that was another reason I applied for it. But I worked with a friend in New York, in the New York Regional Laboratory, who had died from AIDS. And I remember working in the lab with him when he was sick and saying, gee, I wish there was something that I could do, he as working at FDA, that would help other people who were dealing with this. And but he couldn't think of anything. And particularly where we were in the lab, there really was no outlet to really do something creative or constructive. So when this job came up, I thought, well, I could do this for him, and so took the job. And boy, believe me, when I took that job, FDA was getting clobbered by activists, and there was a lot of animosity toward the agency, and people would call up, and you'd get very abusive telephone calls, and it was kind of a very difficult thing. But I think, you're dealing with people who, if you read And the Band Played On, you really see how nobody was paying attention to it. People were dying at amazing rates, and it wasn't pretty at all. And I think, well, I can understand these people. So I would spend a lot of time on the phone with everybody who'd call me up, and I would say, this is what FDA does, this is what NIH does, this is what drug companies are doing, this is, what everybody's trying to do, here are the problems. Little by little, people often think that the AIDS activists changed the face of AIDS. And I think to a really tremendous level they did. But a lot of those things were already in play. And I think it was the science together with the activism, together with the administrative things that had to take place. All of it had to work together. And I think the really credible thing, to the credit of these activists, is what they did was start to learn how all those pieces worked. And they started to work at all the pieces. So you'd go to an AIDS conference, and they'd be all over the place, and they'd be talking to the people who did the research, and they'd be talking to the people who ran the companies, and they'd be talking to the people who did the insurance reimbursement. And they would start pushing everybody to start working a lot more closely to make the system work because there were so many system problems. And I still think, when I talk to patient advocates today, I say, it's just coming to FDA is not going to solve the problem. You need to talk to all the moving parts and get everybody working together with you because, you need to know what their limitations are. You need to know what the regulatory framework and limitations in the statutes are that FDA has. People thought we had unlimited, ability to tell companies to do anything that we wanted. And I'd say, well, the FDA is sued all the time by outside groups and companies, and we have much less authority than people think as a government agency. It's not a government where the government can tell anybody exactly what to do. And I think that's an issue now where people with expanded access want FDA to make these companies make these drugs available. And you have to say, well, the drug belongs to them. Do you live in a society where if you own it, you control it? You had a lot of people dying, a lot of people getting sick, and a lot of people were panicking, and a lot of people were saying, we really need to know what's going on because nobody else is handling this for us. And I thought there were a group of people who were just brilliant, people from the Treatment Action Group in New York and Project Inform in San Francisco, and there were people in ACT UP. Everybody had a different role, basically, but I think there was a lot of disagreement early on, between different factions of the community. They were the genesis of the FDA patient representative program. They wanted a place at the table. We managed to make that happen. And then I think in the beginning, we had as many as 4 different patient representatives because people were saying, well, this person doesn't represent our point of view. And there were points of view of got to move forward at any cost. You have to be very cautious. You have to move slowly. You have to know how to put these drugs together, and you need to know what the effects are so you can control and manage them. So there were different factions who had different points of view. I think we had a terrific commissioner, David Kessler, at the time, was very open to meetings, so we could set meetings up directly with the commissioner. People would explain how FDA worked and how clinical trials worked, and people would come in, people still do, you should do a clinical trial like this. And Dave Feigl was the head of the antiviral group, and he would say, well, they did clinical trials like that 30 years ago in cardiac medicine, and here's what we found out was missing from this trial design. Because I think people think of it more simplistically than it really is. And there's so many things that show up at the end that you go, boy, I wish we had designed this differently to get this answer, or we have an answer that's kind of questionable now because we didn't really zoom in on this. And I think they picked up very well on that, and they started to just learn about clinical trial design, but also see where the weaknesses were in clinical trial design. And I think that they brought a tremendous thing to the agency by saying people cheat in these trials because you're pushing people into such limited opportunities, and somebody has to die in one arm to show that the other arm is more effective, and that you need to give people options, or else they're not going to stay in that trial and not do anything. They're going to take surreptitious therapeutics, and I think that really changed the way that trials are done. That there are times when you need a placebo, but there's also, a lot of trials that are done. Most trials are not placebo-controlled in serious diseases now, but they're standard of care. There's always a control, so you can see what the active ingredient is really doing by itself. And, they came up with ideas for a lot more expanded access. And I think treatment INDs really grew out of what they were trying to get to. Parallel track was another thing that they had come up with. It didn't pan out. It was not very practical, but the treatment IND really is. And I think that they're responsible for a lot of real forward movement. I think accelerated approval might have been something that was bubbling a little bit on the stove, but they turned up the heat, made it happen a lot faster. I remember being in labeling negotiations. FDA negotiates on the labeling with the drug company, and the label determines how the product can be advertised. So it's a very important thing for the company. So I remember one where we had an AIDS activist in the room, and everybody's arguing over the wording on this label, and they get through all of the really difficult labeling, and they said, "Oh, okay, we'll just take care of the rest. You know, next we'll just do it over the phone or something." And the AIDS activist said, "No, you don't. I know what you guys are like. You're going to say, let's do this later, and it'll be weeks or months before this gets done. So we're not leaving this room until we do it." And everybody did it. And I was very impressed. I thought, that's great. I think expanded access in the AIDS arena was a terrific thing because people were dying very quickly. Excuse me. People were dying very quickly. People would be diagnosed and they'd be gone in 6 months or 10 months. And you had these large expanded access programs because there really was nothing for these people to be taking. And at the time, people didn't realize, how fast the virus replicated. Everybody thought until David Ho's famous paper that this was a very much latent virus and it was just sitting there. And he showed that that wasn't the case at all. And people really didn't have time to wait because it progressed so quickly. And people didn't realize about how the virus replicated and became resistant to the drugs. So people were doing sequential monotherapy. You would use a drug, you would lose the effectiveness because of resistance, and then you'd move on to the next drug. Today we think, well, that would be the worst thing that you could possibly do because the virus could jump one hurdle much more easily than it could 2, 3, and 4. So now 2, 3, and 4 classes of products are put together and the virus stays controlled for a very long time. And people are living relatively normal lives on those drugs. In that situation, those large expanded access programs were fantastic because they bridged the gap between the NDA, the new drug application filing from the company, and the time the drug actually hit the market. And it kept those people alive. And in 1996, when the protease inhibitors were added to the mix, all of a sudden, people who were literally on death's door started to turn around and go back to work and worry about paying the gas bill and the electric bill instead of worrying about, I have to arrange a funeral. And an amazing turnaround. So I think expanded access in that setting was a lifesaver. And I think there are other situations, particularly single patient INDs, where it certainly can be helpful to have the access, but usually they're patients with different types of disease. These are diseases that are not going to turn around that quickly because there's not an etiological agent like a virus that if you knock it out, the immune system, the body recovers. So, but I think that people are so, people become very desperate when you run out of options. And I think expanded access is an option. So I can't say it's not a good thing. I think that sometimes people overestimate what the benefit might be of some of the expanded access uses, which is unfortunate only in that you have dashed expectations when you're hanging all your expectations on this one product. So I don't know that that's a bad thing or a good thing. And I think hope is something that you can't put a value on, and sometimes this is people's last hope. So I think it's a good thing, but I think it's not as effective as it was necessarily with the HIV scenario.
But what do you think was the big lesson that the FDA learned from that whole time period?
I think a really great outcome, aside from the fact that I've got friends who I think are these great AIDS activists, that patients have something to say that's really important to the process and that people can really benefit. I think that everybody's beginning to realize this now. I think the downside of all this is that people believe that what AIDS activists achieved, they achieved by chaining themselves to the door of FDA or to Merck or Glaxo. Whereas I think what they accomplished because they entered into the process, they learned it, they took an active role in it, they were more innovative. I think that people who do this for a living, this is what they do, and um, how to put this, it's your day-to-day thing. You don't necessarily think in extremely innovative ways that you would when your life depends upon it. And I think these guys came in, most of them were guys, and they would present things that people would think, well, never really thought about that. I wonder if we could do that. People would cogitate over that for a while and ruminate over it for a while, and lo and behold, we do some reg writing, and you have parallel track or accelerated approval, and all these things that really made a big difference. And I think drug companies changed the way they did trials. People started to worry more about, can people get to a trial site? Do we have child care available? Are we going to give people bus fare to get there? Are we going to make it accessible in terms of like, well, do you have to take a day off from work to go to the trial site? Or can we make this work some other way by seeing people at night or on the weekends or however they were going to do it? But I think they really brought a lot of issues of the person who's the patient to the forefront and made everybody else think about it in the sort of enterprise paradigm, like all these people who do it for a living, and this is how we've always done it. Here you had a group of people saying, well, think about doing it differently. We started with having the HIV patient reps sitting at the table. They were not members of the committee in the beginning. They used to come to the committee meetings. FDA has advisory committee meetings when you have questions about, does this data really support a finding of safety and efficacy, and how do you balance it? Does it need special labeling to protect people from adverse events if there are some that can be preventable? Those kind of questions come up, and FDA will bring them to an advisory committee. And I think one of the great values of the advisory committee is it's the only place that all of this information gets shared with the public, because FDA has to protect the confidentiality of all the applications. So there's always an open public hearing where the public can speak at the advisory committee, and the AIDS patients would come, AIDS activists would come, and they had a lot to say. But then they had their hour, and then they had to sit down and listen to the conversation. But there were things in the conversation that they thought were being missed or that were misinformed. So they would stand up and they would blow whistles. And it was, the very famous AIDS activism that we know from the 90s. And I think, at some point, people said, why don't we bring them to the table and let them participate in the conversation, which is what they wanted. And so at first they did. They didn't have access to the background materials, but they sat at the table. And they had a lot to say, and it was very valuable. Then we thought, why can't we do this with cancer patients? And in the beginning, there was sort of a resistance to it, because people inside the review divisions who had always done things the way they did them thought, well, if you ask patients what they want, they're going to say you should approve this drug, and it would be that simple. I think that patients, when they get involved in the advisory committee meetings, and especially now, they get all the background material, they get all of the analysis, they get everything from the clinical trials. I think they put more effort into it than all the doctors and the statisticians do, because they're going to be sitting there with those doctors and statisticians, and they want to make sure that their position is credible with those people, that they have something to say that's meaningful, and they always do. And I think, they study that stuff very carefully. They make notes in the margins. They ask really good questions. And I think that they do something that nobody else on the committee can do, which is they can challenge the committee and they can challenge the sponsor. Because I think there's a certain professional courtesy that prevents other people from doing that. And all of a sudden you've got somebody who's the patient. And I think they're in a position to do it, and they do it. I think the other amazing thing about having a patient sitting at the table is that you have a patient sitting at the table, so that nobody can talk about them as if they are a statistic. because that statistic is sitting there looking at you as you're making your point on the committee. And I think that's had some sort of profound effect in the conversation on advisory committees, because people are more cognizant of who they're talking about is the patient. That's who's going to use the product. That's who all of this is for. And there they are. So we can't talk about them in the abstract. And I think that's been a really great advance in maybe medical science.
So comment a little bit on the current status of your program. What does it look like?
Today, we have about 210 patient representatives. They represent about 150 different diseases. We have some challenges in finding people who represent rare diseases, because now a lot of drug development is happening in the rare disease area. So there are so few people in some of these rare diseases, and we need to find people who are not conflicted. So conflict of interest is a big challenge for us in recruiting patients. It needs to be people who don't have relationships with that company, particularly financial, but also people who might have a bias. They might be writing in a blog, and they have positive or negative things to say about products in development or about a company. If that comes to light, FDA is always charged with, like, well, you've put a biased person on this committee meeting. So it's not in my office that we do the conflict of interest. We do the recruiting. Then people fill out a very intensive bit of paperwork, and it goes to a conflict of interest staff. And they go through it with a fine-tooth comb to find out, what kind of biases and conflicts do these people potentially have. Sometimes, if you have somebody who you cannot replace because they have a certain expertise or a certain knowledge, you might announce at the beginning, here's a relationship that we want to make transparent. This person has some relationship or background that might be seen as conflicting, so keep that in mind when they comment. But I think it's a really great program. I think we have people on virtually all the drug advisory committees and biologic advisory committees who present a patient perspective. Their expertise is their experience. And I think that's a challenge for the patient rep, because you're sitting there with people who you've not met before, because there's a standing committee, but the patient rep is specific to the disease that's being considered for a particular drug. So they're the odd guy out on the committee, the new person. So they're sitting there with people who they're probably thinking are world-class scientists and experts, and I'm just the patient. And I think the patients have so much valuable information to say and so much to offer to the committee about, everything in relation to how people are going to be using that drug in the real world, and what the adverse events really mean to them, and how they should be categorized and looked at. And I think that we have more than one example of situations where patient reps simply do not say, yeah, I think this drug needs to come to market. We've had patient reps who vote actually to say, I don't think that the data supports, an approval at this time, or there need to be programs in place to protect people from certain adverse events. So there are risk evaluation and mitigation strategies that can come into play. And I think patients play a big role in that. And I think they're an important part of this equation. How can you do it without the patient? In addition to having people who sit at the table at the advisory committees, we, for a number of years, have been using patient representatives as consultants to the agency. So sometimes a review division will say, we'd like to get input from a patient on a particular drug question, or they'll want to include a patient at a meeting with a drug sponsor to participate in that meeting. So we have expanded that program to a consultation program. And so far this year, we've had 10 internal consultations that patients have participated in. And I think, it's a good beginning. It's something that Congress has recognized as being important. Under the FDASIA 1137 section, it says FDA should be including people earlier in the development process of products than the advisory committee meetings at the end of that process. And I think it's a good thing that is going to pan out very nicely. The reintroduction of thalidomide was a very challenging moment in FDA's history because most people see thalidomide as the impetus for the Kefauver-Harris amendments in 1962, and it changed the way that clinical trials were done and that drugs came to market, and it had a profound impact on the drug industry. And people see thalidomide as kind of the central core of FDA's mission. And so when thalidomide returned a number of years ago for potential approval, there was an advisory committee meeting that was held, and nobody thought to invite people who were affected by thalidomide. So the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada called FDA and said, that's really horrible. You guys don't care about anything and you should have spoken to us. So I was the lucky person who got to call them back. And so I spoke to this guy who was the president of that organization, and he was really, really angry. And the thalidomide indication was going to be for aphthous ulcers related to AIDS. And so his argument was there's no place in this world for thalidomide because it was such a damaging drug. And I said, well, I can appreciate that. And I said, but the people who are dealing with AIDS are dying because they can't even eat because of these ulcers. And if thalidomide is effective, isn't that a place for thalidomide? And kind of yes, kind of no. He said he could see the point, but still, based on their experience, there was no place. And there shouldn't be anybody else subjected to what they were subjected to. And we had a lot of conversations, and they were subjected to some really terrible, terrible things. And I think, what Randy was telling me was that it would have been better to have allowed those people to adapt to the world in their own way. But in the 50s, people thought the way that they should adapt would be to be like everybody else. And so they were subjected to lots of surgeries, to lots of prosthetic devices, things that were just really awful, in his experience. And so what I did was contacted people in the HIV community and said, could we all come together and talk about this? And that guaranteed that the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada would be invited to the advisory committee when we held the next one. They got very involved. They spoke to the people from the HIV community. I think, saw that there are people who were suffering as much as they are, but from something different that could be alleviated by the use of this drug. And they got very involved with the advisory committee process. They got very involved with the company. They were involved in the labeling. They were involved in the packaging because they were so concerned that somebody else would be subjected to the ravages of this drug if it was taken during pregnancy. And I thought that was a great, great experience, that all of us had together. So you get to meet really amazing people in the job because you're meeting people who have a lot of courage, people who are active in their community, who care about other people, because that's why they're advocates. And really terrific experiences that people draw from. And sometimes you go to lunch with people and talk, and you just think, wow, I can't even imagine that people live such different worlds than the one I'm used to. So it's been a great ride, I think, being at FDA and doing this. You really spend a lot of time on the phone with people talking about stuff. And a lot of times, people call up and they think that FDA is the devil. And they go like, I go to these meetings with people in the review divisions and they're working so hard and they're thinking about all of what could happen, as a consequence of using this drug this way or that way. The rapid test kits for HIV, people thought so far outward of how they might be used, how they might be misused, how could they benefit people, how could they harm people. And I thought, it's really great to have thoughtful, intelligent people working so hard. I think one of the things at FDA that's really interesting I guess, any government agency, there's no profit margin and there's no profit emphasis anywhere. So the science can be relatively pure, and people really care about doing the right thing. I think that a lot of people at FDA could be paid a lot more money if they went out, and some people do, and then they come back and they say, well, I felt like this was a more ethical place to work because I wasn't dealing with a bottom line and I didn't have to promote something. I could just dedicate myself to what I thought was the pure science and the evidence. I think it's great to have an agency that does that. I think one of the great challenges for most of the time that I've been in the agency, which has been a really long time, is resources and the fact that people have expectations from FDA and people don't understand what FDA necessarily does, but Congress is always putting more and more pressures and mandates and criticisms on the agency that I think at a certain point, if the agency is going to accomplish them, they have to jettison something else because you simply don't have the resources to do it all. And I think over the years there have been public meetings where they say, what do you think the priorities of FDA need to be? And the public can weigh in on that. But I think people don't realize that the purpose of those is to figure out what we're not going to be doing anymore. And I think that's a big challenge. I think the other challenge is how fast science is evolving. And it's very hard to stay. You not only have to keep up with it, but at FDA, you have to stay ahead of it. So you need to do regulatory science to figure out how do you validate and verify that these products really do what they do when you're dealing with molecular testing and genetic testing, and how do you know that these tests really identify what these drugs are going to be treating, and how do you match things up and get them to move at the same pace through approval process so that they come out at the other end together. And frankly, I think there's a lot of pressure on the part of industry, for example, where regulation costs money. So a lot of parties are saying, well, if you had less regulation, it would cost us less money. And so there should be less regulation. And I think one of the shortfalls or the problems in that thinking is that people believe the reason that you don't have this problem is not because there are regulations to prevent it, but that nobody would ever do anything like that. Or, oh, this never happened, so we don't have to worry about it. But those things don't happen because those products never get to the market, or if you find something untoward about the product and, high risk, that product comes off the market or it's modified or there's a REMS attached to it to protect people and make sure that it's used properly. But I think that's a very big challenge to do that. But I think people don't realize that a lot of the problems that are avoided because you have people overseeing this and that there is the regulation. Because if the regulations never appear out of the blue, virtually every regulation is written to address a problem. And I think people just forget that there was a problem as they're moving forward because the problem disappears. When you think about how all these things come together, coming to Primer, when I was working in the Office of Health Affairs, I used to come to Primer. So I think I came to 3 or 4 meetings then, and I got to meet Joan and other people. And then I went into the HIV office, and I thought, well, I'll never see any of those people again. And years later, I get this email saying they wanted to do something that was HIV related, and so maybe it was expanded access. I can't remember what it was exactly. But I came back to Primer, and it was so terrific. And Joan was so, it felt like you hadn't seen your relative in such a long time. And Joan said, well, let's just think of things to keep you involved in Primer. And it's been so great to be part of the Primer family. So, but but the thing is that all of it comes together and it fits so well because you're meeting people who are really struggling with the same things, which is how do you make products better? How do you get them to people faster? And how do you get people to understand how to use them and what the risks that they're going to be taking to bring these products to a market? And the ethical aspect of clinical trials that I saw appear in HIV years ago. And just recently, I had some emails from somebody that I thought this was very similar. People would participate in clinical trials. Usually it would say in the informed consent, we'll continue to give you this drug if it's successful until it reaches the market. And once FDA approves marketing, then your access to it ends and you'll have to get it somewhere else. Well, people who didn't have insurance couldn't get the drugs, and they felt that they had sacrificed to be in those trials, that without those patients, those subjects, the trials could not have happened, the drug would never have come to market, and now they're being denied the product because they can't afford it. And this was a very similar case in hepatitis C. And I think, um, something that people need to understand when they go into clinical trials is you're doing it on under the circumstances that are laid out there in the informed consent, and you really cannot expect it to be something different. And as much as you would like it to be a lifelong agreement, it's not going to be a lifelong agreement. It's not going to be a guaranteed cure. It's not going to be even guaranteed treatment. And I said to this guy with the hepatitis that it should say right at the top of the informed consent that this is research, and it's really designed to do the following, to answer these questions. And I said, curing you is probably not included there. And I said it would be a very nice outcome, and it's a potential possibility, but there's nothing to guarantee it, and there's nothing in there that should have led you to believe that was going to be the case. But I feel like, so many people go in hoping for something different, and so they hear something different. And I think that's one of the things that maybe it's just part of the human condition.